Welcome to our second panel discussion of the symposium. First of all, thank to the founders for having this wonderful opportunity not only to tell them about what we do, but if you figure there are more than 100 people here, that's, if everybody talks to everybody else, that's something like 10,000 conversations. So it's really a pleasure to see all of our colleagues and meet new ones here. And, you know, parallel processing went out a long time ago over serial processing. So this fermentation of ideas, for me, is really exciting. And also getting to know some of the younger people here who have different ideas than perhaps the older ones. So my name is Jules Jaffe. I am a research oceanographer at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I really enjoyed the first two speakers, Wendy and Marcia, and especially Wendy's comments about curiosity. And I felt it was really exciting to hear that, and certainly what drives many of us is the curiosity of trying to understand what is happening in the ocean. And the changes that are happening, of course, are severe, and we heard a lot about them to begin with. And Marcia also mentioned in her talk about instrumentation, and we weren't the highest priority, because she said, well, if nothing else happens, we've got to do this other thing. But this session is about instruments. And so what has fascinated me, my story, as someone who builds instruments, is this idea of discovery. And if you look at the progress of science, and you ask yourself, you know, what is limiting our ability to further the science of oceanography? Is it that we've got all this data hanging around, and we simply have to analyze it? Or is it that we don't know enough, and if we knew more, we could kind of figure more stuff out? And so I often do some outreach talks and to sometimes groups of students, young students, and the question always comes up, you know, what is it we don't know about the ocean? Do we know like most of what's going on in the ocean, or do we not know everything? And my answer is, well, if the ocean was about this much to know, then we kind of know about this much about what's going on. So don't think that because you've read all these textbooks that it's all been figured out. And the important thing, of course, is convincing them that you could be the person that could figure the next stuff out. Because from my point of view, what excites me is being the first one to ever see a thing as having developed an instrument. And I would also say my abductive reasoning actually has been well supported by NSF. But we're not going to let this turn into a sort of complaining session about NSF. We're going to look towards the future and the opportunities that are imminent and facilitated by the generous support of not only the government-funded institutions, which will hopefully start to be a bit more sane, but also the private philanthropy, which is creating these wonderful new opportunities. Okay, so what about instruments? Let's sort of get to the meat of this panel discussion. And the first thing I thought we could talk about was, you know, what have we done in the past? So if you're an academic and you're required to do scholarship, then you're always being asked, you know, what have people done before, and how well has it worked? And what can we really learn from those examples? So we had this discussion last night in preparation for this. We're not really scripted. We're going to improvise a lot, I can assure you. But we did have this idea that the things that had been done before actually could provide inspiration and guidance to this discussion. So I think the first point that we wanted to talk about was Charlie. We're going to call on Charlie Charlie is one of the inventors of the gliders, which are, as you probably realize, become a really innovative and important instrument for maybe even adaptive sampling, like Cabell talked about, more synoptic. So Charlie, in your opinion, what is it that led to the development of the gliders, and how does that provide inspiration for an instrumentation initiative?
Well, there are a couple of things that came along, Jules. The first was that there was someone in in O&R who tried to, there was an innovative program manager in O&R who tried to get this idea funded to make autonomous oceanographic sampling networks. And he couldn't get O&R to bite off on it. And it was finally DOD through a MURI, a multidisciplinary university research initiative. And he got something like $2.5 million a year, or $2.2 million a year for 5 years from this, and basically funded a bunch of PIs. About a quarter of the money went for gliders. The other 3/4 went for other autonomous vehicle things. Jim Bellingham can tell you the story of that. This was basically sustained funds, so we could actually count on keeping an engineer around and keeping them working. One of the key things about successful instrumentation development for the ocean is to have collaborations between scientists and engineers, not have the engineers off on their own inventing what they think is good, not having the scientists put together sort of baling wire kinds of instruments, but really have professional engineering talent help you out. And the key to that is to have sustained support. Many of us don't get the chance to have engineers work with us for long periods of time. And it shows, and it's kind of amazing that we have gotten as far as we have without a lot of dedicated engineering talent. And it's really that sustained support of engineers. You know, what does an engineer cost these days? An engineer might make a six-figure salary, and at least, and with overhead, double that. So you're talking about a serious amount of money compared to what we get from an NSF grant of maybe $300K or $500K a year. That's considered a big commitment for NSF. So it's hard, and we used to have well, traditionally a lot of the instruments that we have today were developed with a lot of help from O&R. O&R used to be really good about supporting that endeavor. O&R has become more focused now on more applied kinds of things and doesn't have the presence in oceanography that it once had, and that's put a lot of pressure on NSF. And I don't know how to solve the problem really, but we don't have sort of an easy go-to agency for instrument development anymore.
Although I'll go against my own introduction, the OTEC budget, which is the NSF technology division, was actually cut by 50% last year. So it even makes the situation more dire.
Right.
But from your point of view, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about the process of getting money. When you wrote this MURI, what level of detail did the Navy expect? You know, because when I write an NSF proposal, and we do, and we've been successful, we have to pretty much tell them almost what we've done. So what about the idea that you're going to do some more pie-in-the-sky kind of thing that's feasible, but maybe you don't have the implementation plan? Right. So how did that work?
That's the difference in approach that the O&R had. O&R was more of it could be criticized for being a closed club in some ways, but if you happen to be a member of that club, O&R used to go around to each of our institutions and come with a suitcase of money, and you made a case to program managers, and they decided that week whether you got funded or not. Whereas NSF is a peer review system, so as the last panel pointed out, there are lots of criticisms that come up in each proposal review. So it's easy for NSF to end up having a very conservative approach, or they'll only fund maybe more safe things. It's harder for them to be take as many risks as the O&R system had. I don't know how to change that around, but
yeah. So we were lucky enough to put in a proposal at the time that the stimulus package came through, and the proposal was well reviewed, and it was pretty far out, and we were just in the right place at the right time to get a nice amount of money to develop our small autonomous floats. But I think there's a feeling that you got to be willing to take a chance in order to see there's a risk, but then there's a payoff, right? And so in some sense, people think that the bigger payoff actually is more risk. So how the funding agencies balance these things out is sort of an interesting topic. I mean, maybe Ajit can talk about that. Ajit's been a program manager for NSF and also now at the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation. So how do you look at risk versus payoff in your portfolio?
I guess as Paul pointed out, it's a sociological problem, right? So my way of thinking about this is that we need to have a diversity of portfolios where you have some that are well-directed and then others that can be a lot more risk tolerant. And you have to always sort of know that this can't be mutually exclusive. These are all parallel tracks. You've got to have them all on the table. My sense is that you have to, okay, it's a complicated problem, right? So you have this issue of the fact that if it is a closed club, if you're not a member of the club, you're going to be resentful of the club. If you're a member of the club, you are able to fly, right? So as a funder, I can take that on my shoulders and say that I'm not going to spread this around. I'm going to have deep, impactful investment in a few things and see how it plays out. Take that risk and walk away if it doesn't play out. So for me, the thing is that I can do something like that, and we do that. But when we put money in, we think of it as an investment, and we want the scientists to succeed.
Sure.
It is not that we put the money in and we throw the money over the fence and we walk away and if you sink or swim kind of a thing.
Right.
Once we invest, it really is an investment, and we want the scientists to succeed. The payback is that sometimes it's like wresting a baby away from the mother. We have to wrest that instrument away from the scientist. This is something that SOI, I think, actually has very enlightened policies on, where they have as a condition for the funding that the instrument is then available for others to use. Because for me, the other part of this whole challenge, and both of you sitting at this table as well as many others in the room, that you don't want to let it go till it's perfect. 15 years later, you're still trying to make it perfect. That baby is still not ready to walk yet. And I think as a funder, it is up to me to pull it away from you. And this is crowdsourcing in a slightly different model, where I want other scientists to test your instruments, those whom you don't collaborate with.
Right.
Because there's a good payback for that. They might come up with applications that you didn't think about. They're going to test instruments in ways you didn't envision. And that all makes for a more robust instrument. So I just think there are many ways of doing this, and I guess I'll stop for now, but I have in my mind at least 3 different parallel tracks in which instrumentation need to happen.
Okay.
I'll just put them out there, and then
Sure,
we'll continue the conversation.
Great.
One is the ways we've always done it, which is finding the best ocean scientists and engineers and making them work together to come up with novel instrumentation. The second is transferring instrumentation that have been developed in other fields. For example, in the biomedical realm, as Deirdre will probably talk about. And the third is in the brave new world that we live in really trying to figure out how we reach out and engage with the broader community out there who want to engage in building instruments just for the fun of it. There is the maker movement, and I think as oceanographers, now the Open ROV folks are here. They've gone and done it, but it's not because an ocean scientist went to somebody and said, this is my problem, help me solve it. They did it because they just did it for the fun of it. And I think the challenge that we face is trying to figure out how we engage with that community to help get their help in solving the problems that we face.
Yeah, well, that certainly echoes a lot of the Schmidt and MSTF's interest in some sense modernizing the process. At the same time, we're actually building new instruments. And in conversations with the Open ROV guys, it's been very fascinating for me to kind of go outside of my comfort zone and think about doing things differently. And I think it's also very exciting. You do have a slide. Did you want to show it now, or did you want to show it a bit later? Or
Since you brought it up, I'll show it.
Okay.
This will
yeah,
be my
sure.
2 bits.
Yeah,
Okay.
this is unstructured, so we're kind of.
So we've heard reference to the Argo program. You see a picture in the top there, in the top right-hand panel is 3,600 floats were in the water in Argo as of yesterday. And what I like to point out, one of the program managers at NOAA points out that the aerial coverage of the average float in the Argo program is about the same size as the state of Virginia. That's because he's a NOAA bureaucrat and is in Washington, D.C. So think of it as the aerial representation being about the same as for U.S. senators. If you took the area of the United States there in the slide and push it over across the ocean, you count about 100 floats. So the aerial representation, imagine, well, it probably doesn't make a big difference here in a smaller state like Hawaii. If you had an Argo float off of Maui and one off of Kauai, they don't disagree too terribly much. But think about one in East Texas or West Texas, or one having two floats to do the entire state of Alaska. It's a really pretty tiny coverage. The Argo network was designed to look for broad scale, large scale, basin scale kinds of changes. It doesn't see the tiny stuff. Now in the bottom, your eye is caught by the movement there. There's a model of how we think maybe the ocean works, of velocities in the ocean, a model of showing lots of eddies. Well, there's a tremendous amount of variability there, and you certainly couldn't resolve any of those eddies with the kind of network that you have with Argo. You'd need far more dense coverage. So the Argo floats, we're playing with those at something like $20,000 each. Gliders might be able to see some of the mesoscale variability a little better, and sub-mesoscale variability, they certainly can. But they're something like $100,000 each. They're not such complicated things. My cell phone is one hell of a lot more complicated than one of these gliders or floats, and it costs a whole lot less than one of these. So our big problem is trying to get across the economies of scale, or whatever it is, to drive the cost of our sensors down to where we can have thousands, tens of thousands, millions of sensors in the ocean, all being able to resolve things and resolve the variability, the important variability that's there. It's important for physics, for biology, for chemistry, everything. The ocean's a fundamentally turbulent place, has many orders of magnitude of scales, from mixing at centimeter scales to basin scales in several, I think it's 9 orders of magnitude or something in size. We really don't get to see very much of the ocean because we don't get access to it because we have such a sparse network. So really the thing that the Schmidt Foundation could help us out with is to try and make the leap to be able to have instruments that are much more inexpensive, that we could put out things for hundreds of dollars or even $1,000 or something like that. Would be a huge step for us. So that's my pitch.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I guess the global, if I could summarize what you said, what you're saying is that there are many spatial and temporal scales in the ocean that are important from the scientific point of view, that we are pretty much incapable of measuring today because we don't have the instruments to do that. And what we'd like to do is create a facility for reducing the cost of those instruments. And it's been a continuing challenge for almost all of us who are building instruments, and certainly in our lab, to be walking around with an iPhone in your pocket and looking at it and wondering, wow, if I could put this in an instrument, it would revolutionize in some sense. So we've thought, we're in San Diego, we have Qualcomm, sort of thinking, can we somehow partner with these companies that are creating this technology, and the monetization of that is probably the thing that needs to be challenged, because in some sense, there's a lot of iPhones being sold as compared. So is it the philanthropic organization's obligation to figure out not only how to make this, but to also buy all these things? It's just an interesting topic for future. So now I'm going back to a little bit out of order here, this idea of looking to the past. Ed had a number of examples of instruments that had been developed, say, in the last decade or two, and he had some interest in highlighting those. So if we could have the next slide, please. And Ed, the floor is yours.
Sure. And first of all, full disclosure, I'm not an instrument developer. And that's okay, because we've already heard from Charlie and others that to really make these things work, you have to have end users, people developing use case scenarios, operation scenarios, system requirements, working hand in hand, pretty much, I think, through the full development process to get to where you need to be. And before I launch on this slide, one of the things that's already come up has to do with education. So my PhD is in marine biology, and I got very little engineering training or training in computer science for that matter. And I think that's something we really need to seriously consider. Oceanography, during its history, has been known for interdisciplinary collaborations, sometimes largely driven by folks interacting on ships. But the technologies are moving fast around us right now, and that's a big educational challenge too. So I was able to work with engineers and developers, and there's so many instruments that are being developed in different contexts now. To me, it's just a good idea to step back and say, well, what do we want to measure? How do we measure it? And for any single thing, there's not a single answer. And so in that top left-hand panel, that's a new oxygen sensor that's been developed by Niels Peter Resbeck and his collaborators. Now, we can measure oxygen, and it is being measured on many distributed systems in very good ways and cheap ways with optodes and so on. But a lot of the ways that we measure oxygen, we can only get down to about 1 micromolar. And that's fine for a lot of measurements and inferences we'd like to make. But if you think in a contextual area where we have some important problems now, for instance, in oxygen minimum zones, which are expanding and whose kind of changes in chemistry and biology we're only starting to get a handle on now, knowing the actual oxygen concentration rather than just saying it's below a micromolar can be quite important. And so Niels' new oxygen sensors have increased the sensitivity 1,000-fold, so now we can measure down in the nanomolar range, which turns out to be pretty important because we're learning that organisms can respire down in the nanomolar range. They're still involved in oxygenic processes. And the amount of oxygen that's there is going to influence the transformations of matter and energy, losses of nitrogen from the ocean, so on and so forth. So it's not a trivial question to talk even about one thing like oxygen. We should have oxygen down, right? That's easy to constrain, it turns out. It's a contextual problem as well. So that's the reason I wanted to put that up there. And it's been a great development. And these really sensitive oxygen sensors have been deployed on CTDs. We're learning a lot about kind of the variability in oxygen fields and so on.
And just out of curiosity, what is the price of something like that?
Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you. They're pretty new, so it's development. They're not being mass produced yet. Resbeck's been involved with a lot of electrode development and so on. They're much more complicated. This is maybe not the device that you would send out in a massively distributed mode, right, but it's contextually still important. So there's issues with regard to spatial and temporal resolution that we want to constrain a particular measurement with, and then also sensitivity. That's the point of that. And then there's been a lot of great development. Cabell Davis was up here, and he mentioned the amazing kind of observations that are being made with the video plankton recorders and just being able to see the organisms. And the example I put up in the right top-hand side there is the work of Rob Olson and Heidi Sosik with their underwater flow bots, flow cytobots, and imaging flow cytobots that can, adapt this technique of flow cytometry, which again came from the biomedical field and led to the discovery actually of Prochlorococcus, one of the most abundant photosynthesizers in the ocean. And now that's been leveraged even further so that these devices that Rob and Heidi have developed can be put out for 2 months, and they're basically taking the movie of the diversity of plankton, how they change over time, even growth patterns, diversity. And these are things that we haven't been able to resolve all that well in space and time. And so there's a lot of movement forward right now, which I really think is a tremendous success for folks that are developing these instruments and using them in the field, basically taking the movie.
But such devices are still quite expensive.
Yes, they are.
And so we see a need, as Charlie has outlined, perhaps for reducing the cost of something like that so that multiple copies could be put out for looking at spatial diversity.
Absolutely.
As well.
And I would pass that on to Deirdre in a second, because there are microfluidic cytometric devices which are much smaller, much less power. They're going to take a lot less of an investment. And so that's a future direction that you can see developing.
Sure. And then lastly,
Lastly, in the bottom left there is, that's really just an example to indicate that we need to kind of integrate both the operational scenarios and resolution that we sample with new technologies. And this is just an example I'm familiar with. It's not self-promotion, but it's basically being able to take the right kind of samples. Now, we're interested in tracking microbial populations. If you do that in a fixed mooring, what you're really doing is looking at the superhighway of microorganisms passing by your sampling device. So you're sampling space and time at the same time. And so drifters are common in oceanography. We rarely can use them to sample organisms and follow a population over time. And so this is just an example of being able to follow communities of microorganisms, populations, over days, and measure, and then coupling that kind of deployment with a lot of the advances in genetic and genomic technologies, which really give you high-resolution profiling of not only the gene content, but how those genes are turned on and off over time. You're basically taking a movie of how organisms are behaving in the environment, response to the environment and one another, and whether they're synchronous or not. And so the top graph is just showing a set of genes that are involved in photosynthesis, their diel rhythm and how they're increasing and decreasing over time. And it's just a validation with an example of the same organism in the lab. But the real point is that we can track communities, and communities are what we want to understand and how they're interacting with respect to flux of matter and energy and productivity and up into the higher food chain. So it's the coupling of both the deployment scenario, the types of instruments, and then the downstream data processing, because the genomics require considerable computational ability and facilities to properly interpret, and people were mentioning looking at pattern. We really have to be able to better distinguish kind of the pattern and process that come out of these particular expressions of organismal activities. And this is early days for this. So we need to make this sort of type of analysis a lot easier and cheaper and distributable as well.
So I would amplify that point. I guess I have some liberties as moderator. That there is a dire need in the community for Lagrangian tracking of water parcels. So imagine a cubic meter of water, and the mass and energy is ultimately what we're interested in. What is the succession of organisms that are eating and being eaten, whether photosynthesizing and pooping out detritus that turns into marine snow? And we don't have anything now. We have nothing in the ocean community, really. We can depth stroke things. We can put incubator bottles down and do predator-prey using some of Mike Landry's ideas. But part of our interest is in this idea of following communities in space and time. And it's a huge opportunity for the development of instruments. So I will just amplify that point. And now I'd like to move our discussion a little more forward in terms of what we had on our agenda. And so one of the questions we sort of asked ourselves is, okay, the world's different today. If you read Ray Kurzweil, he can tell you things are going to change, which you already knew. But he didn't necessarily tell you when it was going to change, which nobody knows. But nevertheless, there's lots of stuff around. And so, what are the new opportunities for technology development? And what can we import from perhaps other areas? So I'm delighted that Deirdre Meldrum is here, who has been working in the biomedical world. And you're basically a bag of saline solution, so you may not like that idea. You're also kind of a petri dish for bacteria. But so what can we import from those more profitable sort of areas that might help us, figure out, the phytoplankton don't have, Blue Cross PPO plans, but can we take advantage of what's been going on? So please give us your opinion about that.
Thank you. And it's great to have the opportunity to be here. Most of my career, I've been working as an engineer hand in hand with medical doctors and scientists to develop new technologies that enable biological experiments that couldn't be done otherwise, so we can better study and understand disease. And so about 7 or 8 years ago, I met John Delaney, and he proposed an idea of developing a swarm of autonomous robotic fish to perform spatio-temporal biogeochemical measurements in the oceans. So was thinking further, well, how could we adapt some of our biomedical technologies to be useful in the ocean environment? So we've been developing a concept of sensor robots or sensor bots, and the idea is that we make them small and cheap and be able to deploy thousands of them and be able to perform biological, chemical, and physical measurements, collect the data, and analyze it to really understand all the intricacies of all these ocean systems in an integrated system fashion. And so if we zoom into one of these sensor bots, the idea, and I know many of you here are developing different aspects of this, Jules and Oscar and others, but if we could develop a sensor bot or a robotic fish, what would it look like ideally? We could develop it as in terms of a biomimic robot, and I know there are people in the robotics community that I've interacted with for years that are developing like soft robotic fish. Daniela Roos at MIT is an example. There are researchers doing biorobotic fish like eels and lampreys in Italy, Paolo Dario, Sweden, France, Switzerland, and so on. So they're developing a lot in terms of robotic capability to be a biomimic like a fish. What other aspects could we have on here? Well, the skin could be patterned with thousands of chemical sensors to measure the oxidation, reduction, pH, other ions, pollutants, other chemicals, and so on. And in our biomedical work, we've worked over a decade on developing microscale devices and sensors to measure the metabolism of live single cells. And we have capability microfluidic devices that can measure the oxygen consumption rate, and Ed was talking about that. We measure at femtomoles, that's 10⁻⁵, per minute per cell. So we're measuring the oxygen consumption rate of a single cell, pH, glucose, ATP, calcium, potassium, zinc, iron, and so on. And we continue to build our suite of sensors and further developing them to put them on the skin of a robotic fish. We've just not that far along, but we've tested the materials, substrate, and the sensors for a year at depth in the ocean. And so that would be one idea for the chemical sensors. There could also be in the skin chemical and acoustic active materials for communications. And I know Jules is doing some work with his underwater autonomous explorers where they're all acoustically networked. The eyes, and I was just talking with Oscar, they have the eyes for imaging, 3D, HD video cameras, and other capabilities. Another thing we've done in the biomedical world, and the inventor of that's actually here to flow cells into a capillary, take 500 images around it, do a 3D reconstruction, and quantitatively analyze over 800 morphological features of a cell. Can do all of that, the imaging and the processing in 1 second per cell. So imagine if you go into the guts of the fish, you could have these instruments in there, and again, taking advantage of the biomedical technologies. You know about the DNA sequencing. Well, I've been heavily involved in genomics for a long time, and over the last 5 years, that technology has been challenged to develop the capability of sequencing a human genome in $1,000. So you've seen this rapid pace of technology development. So eventually those sequencers will be able to be put inside the fish. There's ways to analyze the DNA, RNA, proteins. Some of you do use mass spec in the oceans already. We're developing a capability to look at the DNA and RNA with an isothermal biological technique that's pretty new, because that's important so that you're utilizing less energy, and so on. So we have much to gain from the biomedical community in terms of developing the technology, but then also making it smaller and cheaper, so it's low power, so that we can use it in the ocean environment. And then propulsion and power, it could be buoyancy controlled, liquid propelled, taking advantage of the environment. I know Jim Bellingham has the renewable at sea powered robots, could take advantage of wave. There's the wave robots, whatever they call, wave gliders. Take advantage of the thermal, sunlight, changes in pressure, or efficiently harvest the anaerobic microbes and store the energy, or go to some docking station or some cabled observatory and recharge inductively, and then also have the opportunity to download this mass amounts of data from these robotic fish. So I think that, and then all these things, a lot of these technologies could possibly go on the Argo floats, because they're already widely distributed around the oceans on the different gliders. So I see great potential and leveraging opportunities. Certainly it's a challenge to develop these technologies to work in the ocean environment, but I think it's doable and would be really exciting to have that spatial temporal measurements of all these different systems.
Yeah, so thanks so much. So I guess, brief summary, which I think you put much more elegantly, is there's a need for, as well, distributed sensing, as we've already seen, at least in a few situations. And it does seem like the biomedical research community, who yourself one of the leaders in that area, certainly you have a large center for doing this kind of stuff, provides interesting opportunities for oceanographers, and we really would love to learn more about those. And being at a place like Scripps and having been at Woods Hole, I mean, what ultimately gets you in the end is the connector, and so all these wonderful things, we need to connect the connector people with the biomedical people so that they can think about how to put stuff in the ocean that works. And so, I really appreciate that. And we've wondered for years about how we can import this biomedical technology. And then lastly, we're going to have the question and answer period in about a minute. But I'm going to show my slide next. So this is kind of what we've been working on, not kind of, this is what we've been working on for the last decade, basically. And motivated by some conversations with some of the people at NOAA. So as an engineer, we basically look to the scientists. And so it's an interactive process. I guess I would say I'm either a scienteer or an engineerist, and some people think I'm more like a mouseketeer, but that's okay. But we sort of have ideas like, well, what if we built this, and then we go to talk to the scientists, and I'm like, I don't think we could use that. And then they'll say, well, here's what we really could use. So as Charlie's pointed out, it's this sort of interaction between the scientists and the engineers. So years ago, I was at a meeting, and I'll make this a fairly short story, where a number of people, Jane Lubchenco, Simon Levin, were there about looking for ways of how are we going to plan these marine protected areas. We want them connected. We're worried about larval transport. Well, do we know enough about coastal circulation to figure that out? The answer is no. And so we started thinking about developing these larval mimics. And we were pretty lucky with our abduction proposals, abductive, I should say. And we got enough money over the last 10 years to actually build a small swarm of these 1.5 liter floats, which we actually deployed this past September. And the actual costs per float for the stuff inside there was around 3 to 4K. And we've actually tracked these in 3D, and I haven't the liberty now to tell you all the details, which we'll be talking about here in Hawaii in February. So I hope many of you can come and hear that. But it's working. We can build these things. They're not going to be really expensive. They have limitations. But the next thing is the sensors. So we've talked about sensor technology. We can sort of track the currents to a certain extent. We can tell them to sit at depth, and we can look at internal waves coming through, looking at density interfaces. So the other thing we do in our group is underwater microscopy. And my own sort of path through this was I'm an electron microscopist by trade, so I guess I'm getting smaller and smaller as my career. So I've been under Keck Foundation support. So Keck Foundation, another philanthropic foundation, we got, they basically wrote us a nice check about 1.5 years ago. And this has created so many wonderful opportunities for us to create these underwater microscopes with scanning lenses for getting around problems of short depth of focus. And we now have diver handheld benthic microscopes for going look at coral zooplanktivory and things like that. And so this sensor development thing is really exploding because the optoelectronics people are making things cheaper and cheaper. Everybody's, got the GoPro and putting it in the water. So our vision is to couple this with what's on the right. And this is a slide that I showed about 5 years ago at the Birch Aquarium, where we need to get kids involved. And so my own career was, I did well in the math and science, and basically all the answers are in the back of the book, and so, but then when you get to the last chapter and they say, well, now you could write the next chapter, then I actually got excited. And so my feeling, I love that idea that Paul talked about. We're going to put these cameras out in the coral reef, but let's couple it to a scientific question that we don't know the answer to, and ask kids to be engaged to help us figure that out. And I think that coupling of the technology with in an inquiry-based mode, maybe hypothesis-driven, as Paul has said, what kills off the phytoplankton? Is it the predators? Is it nutrients? Put a couple of microscopes out there. So we'll have a lot more time to talk about outreach in the next few sessions. I'd like to open up this floor now. Ajit has something to say. I'm sorry if I've neglected you. I apologize.
No. Not at all. No, just when that slide was there, or you
Can
also
we put it back? Yeah.
or you saw it in Ed's slide. But as we toss it out to the to the audience, I guess I would like to put out a challenge there.
Great.
Which is that as scientists, I was one. I lost a few brain cells, and so now I'm sitting on this side of the table. But as scientists, I think our challenge is to try and figure out how we can engage with the public in doing both science and outreach. So there are a couple of projects that I know that we are involved in where the pictures that are being taken by those microscopes, either by the phytoplankton, by the flow cytobot, or by a zoo glider that's at Scripps, those pictures can be made available to the public for identification by anybody, which then feeds back into machine learning to increase the accuracy of your ways of identifying the organism. And for me, this is a win-win in all sides, and kudos to those that came up with that idea. But for me, this is the kinds of ways in which we can actually engage the public, educate them, but at the same time get our science done. And what I would like to sort of throw out there as a challenge is other ways of doing things like that.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess my own personal opinion is to couple that with a scientific question where kids are actually helping us to discover the answer. And I think that's a sort of win-win-win scenario, not just win-win, because then they're actually helping us and they're exploring as well. So now, let's open up the floor. I'm sure people have lots of questions, or maybe you're thinking more about lunch, but we do have another 15 minutes.
Yeah. When you're asking questions, if you could please make it a question.
As opposed to a pontification.
And we would also like to ask you to stand up because some of the audience on the other side may have difficult time seeing who is asking the question.
Okay, I'm Chris Sabine from PMEL, and...
Oh, wait, this is your second question. I'm sorry, you're over the limit.
Oh, sorry.
Somebody else? No kidding. Okay, go ahead.
First one for this panel, though. I love the idea of putting out loads of sensors and platforms that can measure all kinds of things, but I don't know if this is really a question, or maybe I can frame it in a question.
Don't worry about it. We'll handle it. Don't worry. It's okay.
My comment is that I think we need to not forget about calibration and validation. You know, we can go and throw all these millions of sensors out there and get lots of data, but if it's crap data, it's not going to do any good.
Right.
And so we can't lose sight of the importance of good quality data, and we need to build that in as an integral part of developing and deploying
I'd never
these
claimed
sensors.
that any of the data I collected was crap. I'll tell you that. But Ajit has something to say, please.
No, so again, I would like to throw this back as a challenge, Chris, which is that nobody wants crap data. You know, we accept that as baseline. But how about us actually doing some statistics on trying to figure out how we can use where the statistic of increasing the N to reduce your error bars? And you know, I believe that there is work to be done there it is being done. I just saw a paper in GRL recently where they're using cell phone battery temperature to measure air temperature. With all the errors that is involved in measuring the reporting of the cell phone battery's temperature, they're still able to come up with accurate enough measurements of air temperatures in major metropolitan cities. So my sense is that, again, the challenge is for us to try and come up with ways in which we have the really third decimal place accuracy sensors. We're not saying we don't need them, but we augment them with sensors that may not have that same level of accuracy, but you make it up by increasing the number of sensors.
Yeah, so I guess
Absolutely.
I mean, I think your point, if I could paraphrase what you're saying, is that quality control is very important, and I would certainly amplify that. There's no question about that. Deirdre wants to.
One more comment.
You want? Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, and we spend a lot of our time on calibration and validation, and again, working hand in hand with the scientists, making sure the measurements are biologically relevant and what we're measuring what we think we are, but putting in also references, redundancy, all kinds of different things.
Okay, next question. Okay, please.
Hi, I'm Michael Taylor. I'm from Bluefin Robotics. So I wanted to ask a couple questions, well, a question about some of the outreach stuff you were discussing and in the last panel as well. I love the idea. I love the idea of school kids having access to data from floats, from monitoring their own little marine population, seeing it die, seeing the impact of what's going on in our oceans. And I actually think there's no shortage of curiosity from that age demographic in our population, even older demographics as well.
Even in the hole in the donut region.
Even in the,
Yeah.
I'm from Ohio.
Okay.
I can
There you
certainly
go.
attest to that
Yeah.
problem.
Central America.
Tides,
Yeah,
what
yeah.
are those? I think though that the challenge you run into more is actually on the teachers, and it's not again that the teachers aren't curious. It's that they don't have the background. They're intimidated by it. They don't have time to teach it because we've moved to sort of teach the test model. It seems like the way to get around this is for standardized testing to require you to write a 2-paragraph research summary of what your float did. But what's the path to that? How do we get to that point where that natural curiosity can really be leveraged in the classroom instead of hoping that some kids discover it in their free time?
Yeah, so I think it's a wonderful thing to point out. I mean, we do workshops for teachers. I mean, Jason Project and all that. There's a representative here. They probably will talk more about in that session. But a lot of the teachers are intimidated by, like physics teachers, are intimidated by it. And I agree, we need good ambassadors. So I try to inspire teachers, because by doing that, then I hope the teachers will inspire the kids. But yeah, we need wonderful teachers. But the other part of this is, look at Khan Academy online. I mean, here you have a guy doing it in his garage, and he's like, I don't know what the circulation. There are people here, IT people probably could tell me more. But there's new opportunities for communicating things to the public, maybe less teacher-centric. And I'm just throwing that out as a sort of random idea here. Next question, please.
All right, so this question is coming from the internet audience, specifically Bruce Applegate from UCSD.
He's in the internet, yeah. Bruce, where'd you go? Yeah, he's on a ship someplace. Yeah, right, yeah, okay.
All right, there we go.
I was doubling down on my chances to get to ask.
Yeah, okay. It's good to play the statistics, but we need the quality control here, yeah.
So, in the old days, places like Bell Labs funded the long-term support that Charlie, you were talking about. And the problem with supporting engineers who can focus sustained energy on long periods of time to solve something and build things. Is that model dead? What looking forward, and what you guys want to build? What's the model for, is there a model that involves, say, a private industry, or is it philanthropic? How can we support engineers?
Well, look at Mabari. I mean, I was just at the IEEE meeting, and I gave some tutorials there. And, we've got Scripps where I am, we got Woods Hole, and in some sense, and UW, we kind of gave birth to a lot of this technology. But you look at Packer Foundation and the sustained support, these guys shone. I mean, I'm remiss to admit that to some extent. But yes, there's a model. If you get a bunch of scientists together and put in an excellent engineering staff with sustainability and allow people perhaps the freedom to ask questions and take a risk that maybe something isn't going to work. I mean, it's sort of motherhood to say that, but what's sort of sad about what's happening to the universities and perhaps the non-philanthropically funded places is that the level of support now for adventuresome work in ocean technology is certainly decreasing without naming any partners. So I hold Mabari up as a wonderful example of a place that's doing, and I think they'll just keep getting better and better. And Deirdre, did you want to say
Well, I'll
something?
just make a couple comments. Most of my funding's been with NIH and some from the Keck Foundation, but at NIH, there's been lots of funding put in for technology development. The sequencer that I mentioned drove universities and industry to develop really novel technologies that were needed for sequencing. They've had programs for advanced technology development where there's a need to get one-of-a-kind instruments to a larger scale and faster and cheaper so they could be used in the Human Genome Project. That's another example. So I think maybe having challenges like that that inspire these teams to go after some kind of need in the ocean community for whatever that instrument or measurements are would help drive the development.
Like the X Foundation challenges and things like that?
But but also in the federal agencies too.
Next question.
Just need money.
Paul.
Yep.
Oh, sorry.
Dennis Bartels, Exploratorium.
Hi, Dennis.
Hey. I just wanted to broaden the conversation a lot because in each one of these sessions we do talk about outreach and ways to really connect with the public, which I just am so excited about. But at the same time, I think our models are a lot simpler than the problem that we're facing. And so we always think straight from the scientist to the kid. I mean, that was certainly the NSF Center strategy for the longest time, is they ask you to take 10% of your budgets, and then all the labs tried to figure out how to solve all the school problems. Or, take it straight from the teacher to the student. And I think what we're seeing is a much more robust learning ecosystem. You mentioned the Khan Academy, I love it. There's a whole community out there, quite frankly, that studies and practices science communication all the time. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations that really sort of fill in this gap. And if you just imagine yourselves, when did I, as a human being, learn about oceans and get excited about it? My suspicion is it was probably from an informal space or a sort of a unique or different kind of partnership than the ones that we sort of simply assume as sort of straight line relationships. So I think there's a bigger community that can really help us address some of these outreach questions than maybe is perhaps in the room.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful to point that out. And of course, it's the onus is upon us to make it sexy. I'll use the words, make it interesting for people. Because, I mean, just telling them the oceans are getting more acidic or the world is heating up, it's kind of nerdy in a way, I mean, I think there are other potential ways to make it more engaging, even though those issues are really important. And I think we also have to realize that the impedance matching with this generation, I mean, how many of us have sat at a table at dinner with a 16-year-old, and every 15 minutes, they're checking their email, And so it's like, how do we engage? You do that, Charlie?
That long?
No. Yeah.
It was that long between...
Yeah, so I think the impedance matching, is important as well. So we need young ambassadors who can tell us how to do that as well. So let's hope we can find them. Next question.
John Delaney from the University of Washington.
Hey,
I actually do have a question.
Fine.
I think one of the great challenges to the technological side and to oceanographers in general and educationally as well is having interactive capability with remote portions of the ocean.
Okay.
None of you so far have mentioned interactivity, meaning folks who aren't there can actually do something that will affect what's going on there wherever the transient event might be, whether it's at the patchiness level of, I mean, Paul quoted 9 orders of magnitude of scale and time. Patchiness is something we have yet to solve. There's a big question. So could each of you speak briefly about your vision of how the kinds of things you've talked about could enter the world of being interactive, science-wise, education-wise, public-wise?
Well, maybe we'll not make each of us do that, but we'll allow whoever would like to volunteer to do that, Any volunteers?
I could just mention in the sensor bots is that the idea is that they would be able to communicate and also respond to events so that they'd be interactive in that sense, that they would be interacting and then also be sending data. So maybe there'd be the capability of interacting with them in terms of the data going to land and to people being able to control some of them. Yeah,
I mean, years ago we had this idea to perhaps put an observatory in the Scripps Canyon and then have kids compete for time, just the way people compete for observatory time. The other thing is have a kit. A kid could make a kit, and it's an underwater robot, and you launch it in an area that's restricted, and it actually swims around, and then it comes back and reports to you what it found. And then you basically tell it, oh, go do something else. So I think, and it would be gathering science. So that's two examples of, and I agree, engagement can take place on an interactive level as well, and that's really exciting to see that. Ajit, did you have? Okay, so let's move along here. We just have time for another one or two questions. So
I'm Susan Avery from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Hi. I'd like to broaden this discussion with a question just a little bit further about and what John said.
Okay, great.
And we've talked a lot about the engagement, or sort of the ancillary payoff, if you will, by engaging the public and education. But I'd like to have you comment on what might be the value of instrument development in engaging the for-profit sector, both in terms of funding for development of new instruments and technology, but also for leveraging assets that the for-profit sector has in the ocean already that are probably underutilized.
Gee, that's a tough question. No wonder you're director of Woods Hole. Any volunteers for for-profit models for engagement? I mean, years ago we were asked by CGG, who's an oil exploration company, to work with them on some concepts related to, dense swarms of samplers for geophysical exploration. And so, that's one example. Scripps itself actually has a center that it's spun off for. We have a scientist who's got some amazing upper atmospheric models, which are allowing prediction of things to happen at lower altitudes where apparently people are caring, and then those products are actually then being sold to companies that are worry about such things. So those are sort of two examples that I could think of off the top of my head. But it's tough because there's an impedance mismatch, but it's also, we actually kind of do stuff for fun sometimes, and so that's not the way it works out there. Deirdre. Oh, you don't want, I'm sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have something, Charlie? Okay, please.
Yeah, Susan, the fundamental thing about oceanography is people don't make a lot of money out of oceanography generally. It's not a big commercial enterprise. When we produce oceanographers, they don't get hired by huge enterprises that need them. We're not like an engineering school producing engineering students who get hired right away. We don't have that much of a commercial driver for us. The two big commercial drivers in oceanography that I can think of are oil and gas and the military. So the military is fundamentally back to the taxpayers. We've done all of what we've done basically because of the good graces of the taxpayers. We were all fortunate to live in a country that's wealthy enough to be able to slice off a small amount and devote to what we do. We're all basically professional hobbyists in academic oceanography. When I look at some of these publications from oil and gas, I can go through a big glossy magazine every couple of months that has on every page a bigger facility than the entire UNOLS fleet. On every page, there's this. Maybe some of you know this. UT3 or UT2 is a publication out of UK. There must be others, but it's amazing. That's where the big money is. So, if you really want to get support from the commercial sector, it's probably oil and gas. Of course, what do? They make the climate problem more intractable. So.
Okay, so let's try to move on. We have two more questions. I'm sorry.
So thank you. My name is Michael Jones, and I have a question for you. But before I ask you, I just want to thank you for this topic. In my personal belief as an engineer with a scientific bent, that advances in measurement always precede advances in science. And so I was really excited about this particular topic because I think in this area is where the really game-changing advances can happen. When Eric and Wendy were starting their foundation, I encouraged them to focus on instrumenting the ocean. So I really think you guys are on the right track. I wanted to ask you a question, and it had to do with this how could we engage? And I have a specific question for you. First, I'll just point out to add data to your curiosity. The Khan Academy has taught more complete classes in their way of measuring than all the classes ever taught at Harvard. So just if you want to know the number, it's greater than that. But I was going to talk about, like in the case of like Google Earth, for example, we have 1 billion people that use it every month. They use on the average of 18 minutes each. So that's 18 billion minutes. You can divide that by hours and figure out that it's more than American broadcast television, for example. And we have a lot of people that use that. It's free. They use that to tell stories, Google Ocean. And Jennifer, I think, will be talking later about how we did this underwater street view with the Caitlin's Sea Survey people. That puts hundreds of thousands of people every day going scuba diving and seeing things. So it seems like the mechanisms are there, and businesses and nonprofits have created fantastic visualization means, but only a few scientists seem to, I mean, not a few, I mean, not to, you know, Sylvia Earle's done a good job, but I mean, proportionately, only a few scientists have used any of these tools to really advance their cause. And I was going to say, what do you think the hesitancy is? Because I don't know that we could do more because we're not the scientists. Thank you.
I'll leave that. I mean, I could. Does Ajit want to have a comment about that, or I mean, I'm watching that. He's watching that.
I always have a comment. I have comments all the time, but we'll.
Well, we're involved with groups that do coral reef surveys, right? And it's what do you? I think the people that, so we just had a lecture Wednesday at Scripps. One of our coral reef researchers was there and did show, in fact, the Caitlin Seaview material. And I think there needs to be tighter coupling with the data collection and the actual scientific products that are going to come out of that. And so this group is doing, we have groups doing automated recognition of corals, and it's not clear to me that that data stream is as transparent or amenable to the kinds of processing that they're interested in. So I'm not entirely clear why not. So I'll give you some level of uncertainty in not answering your questions. But I think that I'll put a positive spin on this, and I would say that it would be great for the scientific, Victor's like, but it would be great for the scientific community to more, when you're working with the Australians basically as well. So yeah, let's create tools where we can engage 18 minutes of a bazillion people, and also scientists can use it. It's a veritable goal. So, and Ajit wants to say something as well. So.
2 words, bandwidth and rewards. I think if we can solve that, we might be able to get somewhere.
One more question now, one more. This has to be.
Okay, thank you. Scott Baker, I'm a molecular ecologist at Oregon State University. I work mostly on whales and dolphins. They're sort of the upper end of the trophic level.
No.
But I was very excited to hear about the advances in genomics, because genomic diversity is the basis of our biodiversity. And we're going to need it more with changing climate, changing patterns of exploitation. My question is, when are we going to have the in situ real-time genome through some form of either direct or remote sensing? And I saw some evidence that we may be getting close from one of the from one of the presentations.
Well, ESP is the closest to that, no?
And how are we going to interpret it visually? How are we going to be able? Where are we going to put it? Where are we going to put this information? And how are we going to be able to interpret it? Thank you.
So, Scott, that's a great question. The visualization part in particular. Right now, we're not there yet in terms of technology. We and this is a point to make with how we've been using autonomous platforms like ESP. Is that we're collecting samples. The way I envision that is we're taking a picture. It's a snapshot. Then we take it back to the lab to develop that film. It's not a bad model right now because the technology's not there yet, and we're starting to look at the motion picture using that. Take the snapshot by sampling and then develop it back in the lab using genomics, transcriptomics, and so on. But single molecule sequencing is getting there. Right now, it's not quite there yet, but I would predict in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be able to stream pieces of DNA through a nanopore, read the output in real time, send the data back, and then that gets to the kind of scenario you're talking about. I think the data collection is almost trivial. The data interpretation is a phenomenal challenge. Right. And it's a challenge at the level of pattern recognition and visualization in particular. And I don't have an answer to that, but I think you hit the nail on the head with respect to the challenges.
So, okay, so that's pretty much the conclusion of our session. I did want to point out to the audience, I was remiss to that I'm wearing my fish bow tie here today, because when I'm officiating, as in such a role, I always wear such a tie.
Jules, I have a question I'd like to pose to a panelist.
Okay.
Who picked out your shirt today?
And why didn't you call me before you got dressed?
They're actually...
Bitch stole my look.
Yeah, they were twins separated at birth, actually, even though they don't look alike.
Our wives each picked these shirts out, actually.
There's Russ. I could go on forever. Yeah.
I'm the hammer. All right. Thank you very much, Jules and panel members.
Okay, thank you very much.